think about the last time you went to the airport.
Mm.
You walked up to the security checkpoint, pulled out your driver's license or your passport, and you just handed it over.
Yeah, you don't even think about it.
Right. You don't think about it. You just accept that proving your identity is, well, it's just the baseline requirement for getting on a commercial flight safely. But then you contrast that with the process of, selecting the commander-in-chief of the military
Hmm.
or the legislators who actually write the laws that govern like every aspect of your life.
Yeah.
And suddenly this simple act of verifying your identity transforms into the most exhausting, polarized political fight.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly toxic.
It really is. And you listening to this, you are probably so burned out by this endless debate. One side is just screaming about election integrity, the other side is screaming about voter access, and neither side seems willing to budge even an inch.
Well, it's because we've sort of trapped ourselves in this really rigid binary, right?
Yeah.
Public discourse treats these two vital concepts, like security and access, as this strict zero-sum game.
Like they're enemies.
Exactly. The prevailing assumption is that, any structural gain for the security of a ballot inherently suppresses the vote. And on the flip side, any effort to expand voter access inherently opens the door to fraud.
So today, we're actually offering you a completely different framework, a way to step outside that binary and just look at the actual architecture of how democracy functions.
Right.
We're taking a deep dive into a really profoundly thought-provoking and honestly somewhat polemic essay. It's called The Ballot, right, or Privilege,
Yeah.
by Lev Newmotin.
Yeah, from the channel Uncompressed Thinking.
Exactly. And it approaches this whole debate not as like a political operative looking for votes, but as a systems thinker looking at structural integrity.
And, the visual that accompanies his text, it really immediately sets the tone for his whole central thesis.
Oh, the thumbnail image.
Yeah. It features this standard ballot box, right?
Hmm.
But the padlock on the front of it is being opened by a gleaming golden key shaped into the letters ID.
Right, right.
And written underneath it is this really clear mandate. It just says, protected, not restricted.
Which, I mean, that captures his mission perfectly. He's arguing that pitting voter access against voter identification is just a structurally broken, false choice.
Totally broken.
But before we dive into the specific legal mechanics of, how he untangles all that, we really need to set some ground rules for our discussion today.
Yes, definitely.
Because we're exploring themes that sit at the absolute epicenter of modern political tribalism.
So an explicit disclaimer is definitely necessary here. While the text we're analyzing touches on, highly charged, fiercely debated political themes, our role in this deep dive is strictly to impartially analyze the author's structural and philosophical arguments.
Right. We are not taking a side here.
Exactly. We are not taking a political side, we're not endorsing any specific voting laws, and we're certainly not validating any partisan agendas, left or right.
Hmm.
Our sole objective is just to dissect the architecture of the ideas presented in this specific source material, just to see what those ideas reveal about the systems governing our republic.
And, that structural approach actually mirrors his own personal journey to this topic. To really understand his perspective, you have to realize he didn't grow up steeped in American political traditions.
Right, he had a very different background.
Yeah, he grew up with a Soviet education.
Yeah.
And he explicitly points out that this background left him with a massive blank slate and, frankly, some significant blind spots when it came to American constitutional thinking.
Which is fascinating because approaching a system from the outside often, it allows you to see the load-bearing walls that the people living inside the house just completely take for granted.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Because he lacked that, innate, culturally absorbed understanding of American democracy, he had to consciously study its mechanics as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And his primary guide in that process was a man named Bruce Jensen.
Right, Bruce Jensen. He was a friend and a mentor to Neymotin. And back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they actually worked together on a highly technical team dedicated to nuclear nonproliferation.
Which is quite the background.
Right. And he paints this very distinct picture of Jensen. He says he wasn't just a manager, he was a leader who, quote, held your back.
Yeah.
And more importantly, Jensen possessed this quiet, deeply serious brand of patriotism. Like, he didn't just wave a flag, He had a profound appreciation for the underlying invisible systems that prevent a society from just collapsing.
He essentially became his informal tutor in Civics 101.
Exactly. And when you really look at it, learning the mechanics of democracy from a nuclear nonproliferation expert, It's just a brilliant alignment of
It
disciplines.
really is.
Because if you're working in nuclear security, your entire job is to build fail-safe systems where the stakes are existential. You're operating in an environment where trust has to be absolute.
Verification is non-negotiable.
Exactly. And unauthorized access leads to catastrophic failure. So
Mm.
taking that exact same mindset, that rigorous demand for verifiable, secure systems,
Mm.
and applying it to the machinery of democratic elections, it makes complete sense.
You're trying to protect a highly volatile core.
Right.
I mean, in a nuclear facility, the assumption isn't that everyone walking through the front door has pure intentions.
No, definitely not.
The facility relies on a rigid structure of verification to protect the asset. And Jensen taught him to look for that exact same structural integrity within American civics.
Mhm.
He taught him to evaluate rights, not just as these abstract, feel-good concepts, but as defined mechanisms that actually require protection.
And Jensen actually started that education by asking him a really disarming question about a mundane, everyday activity.
All right, the driving question.
Yeah. He asked him, is driving a right or a privilege?
And that distinction between those two words, that forms the foundation of this entire essay.
It really does.
Jensen explained that driving is, unequivocally, a privilege, and the reasoning relies entirely on consequence.
Because you're operating a multi-ton vehicle.
Exactly. Operating a heavy vehicle at high speeds carries the inherent potential to cause immense harm to other people, to property, to public order.
So because the potential for harm is so high, society can't just hand out keys to anyone who asks.
Right. We demand that you prove your identity. We demand you pass a test to prove your competence. You have to carry insurance, register the vehicle, and, maintain strict compliance with a massive book of rules.
And if you break those rules, the privilege is just revoked.
Exactly. And so he uses that baseline to execute this major philosophical pivot.
Right.
He states, in no uncertain terms, that voting is a fundamental right. It is categorically not a privilege.
Yeah.
However, his core argument is that the conditions under which this fundamental right is exercised must be structured, legally and practically, very much like a privilege.
See, that feels like a paradox at first glance.
It does, yeah.
If something is a fundamental right, attaching, privilege-like conditions to it, like demanding identity verification, checking eligibility rosters, it kind of seems like a dangerous path toward gatekeeping.
Right, that's the fear.
It sounds like a way to transform a universal democratic right into this exclusive club where only the people who can easily navigate state bureaucracy are actually allowed to participate.
And that tension right there is the exact friction point of modern politics.
For sure.
But he resolves it by just stripping away the emotion and pointing directly to the legal foundation of the republic.
Which says what, exactly?
Well, the U.S. Constitution does not treat the franchise as a universal human right applicable to anyone standing on American soil.
Oh, interesting.
The Constitution explicitly and deliberately ties the right to select a government to legal citizenship.
Right. It lays out clear protections, like you cannot deny the vote based on race, sex, or age once someone reaches 18.
Exactly.
But the underlying prerequisite is always legal membership in the nation.
Furthermore, federal law makes it explicitly unlawful for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. So, because the legal reality dictates a strict boundary between a citizen who holds the franchise and a non-citizen who does not, he argues that voting is inherently an administered legal process.
It's a governed event.
Yes, it's governed. The state has an absolute duty to differentiate between those who are legally authorized to choose a government and those who are not.
Right.
And recognizing and enforcing that boundary doesn't diminish the right. He argues it's the only way the right maintains any actual definition.
Because if the process isn't administered, the boundary dissolves entirely.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the two specific concurrent jobs that the government actually has to perform. And this is where he aggressively dismantles that endless political tug-of-war we were talking about earlier.
False choice.
Yes, the false choice. So the modern narrative insists that access and verification are inherently at odds.
Right.
But Nemotin argues this framework is entirely fabricated. His central proposition is that access without integrity is not a functioning democracy, and integrity without access is not a functioning democracy either.
They need both. The government owes its citizens a dual obligation.
So let's examine the first half of that dual obligation, access.
Okay.
He is uncompromising here. He writes that the state must guarantee every single legal citizen a practical, unobstructed, and highly realistic path to cast their ballot.
Yeah, this isn't just a suggestion for some well-meaning pilot program.
No.
It is a structural mandate.
And then the second half is integrity.
Right. The voting system must absolutely guarantee the principle of one person, one vote.
Mm-hmm.
It has to ensure that every single ballot deposited into a box or fed into a machine corresponds directly to an eligible, legally verified voter.
We really need to break down the mechanics of why that integrity piece is so vital, because it goes way beyond just like a vague sense of fairness, you know?
It does. It comes down to mathematical disenfranchisement.
Right. Let's say you live in a town with exactly 100 legal citizens and there's a local measure on the ballot.
Okay.
Your individual vote represents exactly 1/100th of the political power in that town. But if the system lacks integrity and 10 unauthorized people are allowed to cast ballots, well, the pool just expanded to 110.
So your vote is no longer worth 1/100th of the total power.
Exactly.
It has been diluted. And he makes the crucial point that vote dilution is functionally identical to vote suppression.
Wow. Yeah.
Whether you are physically blocked from entering the polling place or your legally cast ballot is mathematically canceled out by an illegitimate one-tail, the end result is exactly the same.
Your political voice has been stolen.
Exactly. Protecting the ballot from dilution is protecting the individual citizen.
Which really brings us back to that everyday verification paradox we started with.
The airport analogy.
Yeah. He highlights the staggering hypocrisy in how modern society operates. I mean, you need a verified ID to enter a secure corporate office.
You needed to open a basic checking account.
Right, to drive a car, to pick up certain medications at the pharmacy.
Yep.
We routinely accept, without any protest, that verification is just required for these daily, localized tasks.
Yet when it comes to the single most consequential action a citizen takes, selecting the government that wields monopoly power over laws, taxation, the military,
Right.
verifying identity is suddenly treated as this suspicious, hostile act.
It's wild. He raises the obvious question, why would staffing the highest levels of federal power require less verifiable care than boarding a domestic flight?
It's a very fair question. A right that cannot be verified at its point of exercise eventually becomes completely detached from the conditions that give it meaning.
But, and this is a big but, implementing that verification brings up a massive structural hurdle.
The access issue.
Right. You can't just wave away the reality that demanding an ID can place a severe, disproportionate burden on certain segments of the population.
It's a very real concern.
If a citizen is working 3 minimum wage jobs just to survive, they don't own a car to drive to some distant DMV, and they can't afford the exorbitant fees to track down an out-of-state birth certificate, mandating an ID becomes a functional poll tax.
Yes.
It directly suppresses their ability to participate. So if he insists on integrity through verification, he has to account for that entirely valid reality.
And he does account for it.
How so?
With a strict, non-negotiable caveat that really forms a linchpin of his entire argument.
Okay, what is it?
He says that if the state determines that an ID is required to secure the integrity of the ballot, then the state assumes the full and absolute obligation to ensure that ID is universally accessible.
Oh, so the burden shifts entirely off the shoulders of the citizen and onto the state.
Exactly. The government cannot simply mandate an ID and then quietly close DMV offices in lower-income neighborhoods.
Or charge processing fees that price people out.
Right. Making the required identification easily, realistically, and affordably accessible to every single legal citizen is a mandatory duty.
Wow.
And he argues that once a state actually fulfills that specific duty, once the friction of obtaining an ID is truly eliminated, the argument that voter ID is inherently suppressive loses its structural basis.
Because the problem was never the concept of verification itself.
Right.
The problem was a state failing its obligation to provide equitable access to the tools of verification.
The dual obligation cannot be severed. You cannot ethically enforce the integrity mandate requiring the ID without simultaneously guaranteeing the access mandate making the ID universally available.
They have to go hand in hand.
Yes, if a state fails to provide easy access, it fails democracy. If a state fails to enforce integrity, it also fails democracy. They must coexist.
Okay, so if the structural obligations of the state are actually this clear on paper, the obvious question is why are we still trapped in such a toxic, confusing public discourse?
Well, he suggests the root cause isn't just a disagreement over election laws. He diagnoses a much deeper societal pathology.
What does he call it?
something he calls conceptual drift.
Conceptual drift. What is that exactly?
It's the slow, steady, often imperceptible blurring of essential distinctions within a society.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, modern discourse has developed this strong tendency to rely on sweeping, universal terms. Words like dignity, fairness, human rights.
Right, which are good things.
They are vital moral concepts. However, when those broad moral concepts are sloppily overlaid onto strict legal frameworks, they begin to erode the precise boundaries that make a system operational.
Ah, I see. So we see this when the strict legal distinction between a citizen and a non-citizen is blurred in public rhetoric.
Exactly. Or when the distinct concepts of voter access and ballot integrity are conflated as if they are mutually exclusive.
Like they're at war with each other.
Right. And he warns that blurring foundational categories, whether it happens through sheer intellectual carelessness, ideological zealotry, or just calculated political greed, it never leads to a more just society.
It just leads to confusion.
Systemic confusion, yes.
It's like sitting down to play a highly complex, high-stakes board game. You spend the first hour learning the rules, understanding the boundaries of the board, and you trust the mechanics of play.
Right.
But as the game progresses, some of the players start quietly rewriting the rules. They blur the lines of what constitutes a valid move, usually depending on who's currently losing, right?
Oh, for sure.
If that conceptual drift continues long enough, the players aren't just going to argue about the specific rule changes. They will fundamentally stop trusting the game itself.
Walk away.
They will walk away, or they'll just flip the board entirely.
And when the board flips, the institutions crumble. Sustained confusion breeds profound mistrust. If the public cannot clearly define what constitutes a valid legal vote, or who constitutes a valid legal voter, the outcomes of the elections lose their legitimacy.
And that vulnerability just opens the door wide to manipulation.
Exactly, which perfectly sets up his explicitly apolitical stance.
Right.
He makes it incredibly clear that this structural framework is not designed to help one specific political party win an election. It's about ensuring the survival of the system itself.
He argues that no individual and no political faction should ever be allowed to extract an advantage from ambiguity in voter eligibility.
None. Because whenever the rules surrounding the ballot are blurry, that ambiguity acts as a magnet for exploitation.
It will be exploited by whoever sees a short-term path to power.
Right. And regardless of which side is doing the exploiting, the final mathematical result is always identical: the dilution of the legal citizen's vote.
So a system that rigidly enforces both maximum access and maximum integrity, that actually protects every single citizen equally.
It actively removes the incentive for political operatives to manipulate the margins.
Because the margins are locked down and verifiable.
Exactly. That is the only mechanical way to restore widespread public trust in the outcome of an election.
And, the necessity of this balance is not just a philosophical theory.
No, it's recognized within the highest levels of the legal system.
Right, like the Supreme Court.
Yes. In the landmark ruling Crawford v. Marion County Election Board, the court explicitly affirmed that states possess a valid, legitimate interest in preventing voter fraud and safeguarding voter confidence.
So maintaining election integrity is a recognized duty of the state.
Yes. The desire for a secure ballot isn't some fringe paranoid ideology. It is a baseline requirement for a functioning republic.
But, and this is the massive warning label on his entire essay, that legitimate desire for integrity can never, under any circumstances, be weaponized to restrict a legal citizen's access to the ballot.
The dual obligation demands both.
Right. They are two halves of the same arch.
You remove one, and the entire structure collapses.
So bringing all of this back to you, the listener, why does understanding this specific framework actually matter outside the realm of federal election debates?
That's a good question.
If we look back at Bruce Jensen, his mentor from the nuclear nonproliferation days, the ultimate lesson is really about how we define and interact with the tools of our own governance.
The essay forces us to stop viewing the ballot as merely an abstract, poetic symbol of freedom.
Right.
It is a highly specific mechanical instrument of governance. It is the literal mechanism by which you, the citizen, exercise power over the direction of the republic.
And because it is an instrument of real immense power, it demands fierce, unapologetic protection.
Absolutely.
It requires systems that verify and secure its use. But equally, it requires completely unrestricted, easily navigable access for every legal member of the polity.
If we allow either the protection or the access to erode, we aren't just experiencing a political setback.
No.
We're actively dismantling the machinery of our own democracy.
And this structural mindset, it really extends far beyond just the voting booth.
It does. Understanding the vital difference between an inherent right and the administrative structure required to protect that right, it changes how you evaluate almost any system you participate in.
Think about like the corporate governance at your company,
Right.
or the bylaws of your local community board, or even your homeowners association. Are the foundational rules actually clear?
Do they genuinely protect the integrity of the group's decisions?
Exactly. While simultaneously guaranteeing that every legitimate member has an unobstructed voice.
Because if the underlying structure is blurry, or if the rules change depending on who is currently in charge,
The outcomes will inevitably be mistrusted and eventually rejected.
we simply cannot sustain complex systems on the fumes of good intentions alone. We have to demand precision, clarity, and structural integrity from the systems that govern our daily lives.
I really want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on this core tension that we've outlined today.
Okay, what is it?
Let's fast forward and imagine a world, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, where biometric technology advances to a point of near perfection.
Okay, near perfection.
Imagine a system where we can verify a voter's legal identity instantly, flawlessly, and without any need whatsoever for physical ID cards, processing fees, or spending hours waiting in line at a bureaucratic DMV.
So, a truly frictionless, perfect verification system.
Yes. The ultimate technological fulfillment of the state's dual obligation, absolute, unassailable integrity paired with zero physical barriers to access.
That sounds ideal.
Right. But if that perfect technology were deployed tomorrow, would the intense, exhausting political fight over election laws finally disappear? Would the
Oh.
tug of war actually end? Or, and this is the real question, would we suddenly discover that the fight was never really about the plastic ID cards or the polling location hours at all, but simply a battle over who holds the ultimate power to define the rules of the game?
Oh, wow. That's the uncomfortable question lingering beneath the entire debate.
It really is.
Yeah.
So the next time you see that endless tug of war playing out on the news, try to look past the politicians pulling on the rope.
Look at the rope itself.
Exactly. Look at the structural integrity of the game itself. That's all for today's deep dive.